All right, I think we're going to get started here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This is our ProLink HFA webinar series. This webinar is held on a monthly basis. We appreciate you taking the time today to join us to talk about setting up the dev module for new funding programs in ProLink HFA. For today's presentation, I'm going to cover a brief summary for ProLink, for those of you who may be less familiar with our company. We'll then turn it over to Joe to cover building your application, setting up new funding programs, and managing your deal. So, I'm Alexa Sanchez. I'm the Sales and Marketing Associate with ProLink. I'm standing in for Bree for this webinar. Joe Cherry is our Senior Consulting Manager at ProLink. He brings over 20 years of software experience, including 10 years at ProLink Solutions, where he's now led 15 full-scale HFA implementations. Again, thank you for joining us. I'll now walk through an overview of ProLink. This webinar series is meant to be a tour of functionality that's available in our systems. It's not a training. It's meant to make our users and anyone who's interested in ProLink HFA more aware of what's available in the system. All right, about ProLink. We have supported the affordable housing industry for more than 25 years. We are currently supporting state and local housing finance agencies, tax credit syndicators, investors, and developers. We are fully dedicated to the affordable housing industry. We work really hard to build systems that are holistic and valuable and connect all of the pieces and people together through tax credit, origination, and the continued provision of affordable housing. We build systems to support all of the different stages of your deal lifecycle, as well as collaboration and involvement you need from others. We have a great team of employees who share in the dedication to helping our clients solve the affordable housing problem. Our team consists of technical experts around affordable housing, and we have a lot of 10 and 15-year plus members on our team. They speak your language and they know this business. This is a high-level picture of the agencies across the United States that we support with ProLink HFA. We are currently supporting 18 housing finance agencies and 2 supportive service agencies who are located in California and New York. And this is what we call our bird's eye view of our enterprise modules for ProLink HFA. ProLink HFA always comes with these 3 areas available to all users. We have our tax credit allocation module, which we've been discussing this module up until our last webinar. Now we've switched into the development module and what functionality is available there. We may end up focusing on asset management and compliance towards the end of the year and definitely into the next with this webinar series. So now I'm going to hand things off to Joe so he can talk about building your application. So Joe, please take over screen sharing so you can get started on discussing setting up the dev module for new funding programs.
All right, thank you, Alexis. All right, so we are going to talk about how to spin up a new dev program. And the idea is that we oftentimes, when we set up clients, we are setting them up for their LIHTC programs or their home programs. We also support any sort of state funding you may have, including state LIHTCs. But we do have situations where new emergent funding comes into play. And so in order for us to understand how to do that, we want to walk through some of the steps in ProLink HFA and Procorum to get you set up for any of these new programs that come into play. So whether your agency is spinning up a new funding program or you're using requirements from an existing program, we can help you manage a program. Emergency funding like ARP, changes to existing long-term programs, these require quickly adapting to get funding to those in need. Too often, application backlogs or red tape can stand in the way of delivering help to the real end users of our industry, disadvantaged Americans. So we know, and we've learned over the course of several years, that implementing new changes can be difficult for clients. Requirements are undefined. Legislature is forcing some deadlines that we just don't know how to handle. And the interpretation is sometimes open-ended. So it's like trying to build an airplane while it's taxiing down the runway. So using tips set forth in this webinar, ProLink can help you manage your new programs, update existing programs, and help your team understand the flow of data from application all the way through the program monitoring. So the first step to running a successful program is defining a set of requirements. These are likely going to adapt over time. But getting information down in some sort of white paper, some sort of document, anything that you can say, here are the idea, the steps that we want to adhere to this program, the requirements that the legislators say we must, use in order to fund these programs. So getting these all listed down is the very first step to making sure that we can translate that information into future program updates, any sort of iterations across the programs as we actually get into these programs. So really getting all your ideas down on paper, review them is really going to be the first most important step to getting this to be successful. When you are going to be dealing with a new program, you are likely going to have an application in place. And so for many of our existing clients, you already have a version of a Smart Docs mapped Excel, a pro forma or an application. So there likely will be some crossover with current details and what may be included for this new program, particularly in the sources and uses. So it may not be everything, but there might be some, funding sources that we may use. There might be some different cost items that we might want to keep in play. So keep the logic that you know. You also may have developers in your state that are going to apply for this program that may apply for or already have applied through your LIHTC funding applications. So if you keep consistency, you may find that developers have a little easier chore in front of them to fill out the application in the order that they're used to. So the next step, once you have your requirements laid out in a document of some sort, you want to lay out those requirements in Excel. So really think of the flow of input that the applicant is going to need in order for the logic of what they're applying for to kind of adhere to some sort of semblance for them. So really, we like to see applications that have tabs laid out. Now, we've seen applications that are just like a single page running down an Excel spreadsheet. Those are a little harder to navigate, especially if you're scrolling up and down in a cursor. So if you use tabbed ideas, particularly splitting out like sources and uses, it's going to help drive the logic when it gets into the system, and then also help you know where you may have some underwriting updates. So you may look at sources and say, hey, you know what? Here's the program. You need to bring in some equity. In which case, it's much easier for you to navigate through a tabbed view in a spreadsheet. Also, when you're including specific information for requirements, think in terms of drop downs and yes, no selections, that kind of concept. We like to see data points that are impossible to edit is a good way to put them. So the idea is that if you just have a free form yes, no, you may have someone put in yes with a capital Y, yes with a lowercase y, just the letter Y capitalized, the letter Y lowercase. Who knows what else, right? So if you constrain each one of these pick lists in your document, you're going to see that you're going to have a little more control of the inputs, and the data flow is going to make much more logical sense going into ProLink. So you want to think about data flow. Once you have the requirements laid out, you want to think about how that data from the spreadsheet from your application is going to get into ProLink and in what logical form. So many of your requirements will be existing fields, but you may have several user-defined fields. So we call those UDFs. And as an example, my latest implementation client, we have over 1,500 user-defined fields that we put in the system for them. Over 500 were driven strictly from their application. So think in terms of screen detail, fields you have available to you, and anything else. We have a robust set of user-defined fields that you can customize them in tabs, customize them in sections underneath tabs. So you really get the opportunity to do some good design and think in terms of where the data is coming from and into what screen or screens you want to push that data. And so within that, you're going to have to think about your reporting. So data in results in data out. So you want to align the data, particularly your user-defined fields, on the correct object, on the correct screen. So when you're in a UDF, you're going to pick where it goes. It's going to be on a dev deal, or it's going to be on a dev property, or it's going to be on a dev funding source. So you want to think all of those things out while you're laying out your application, because it's going to make a lot of sense to be able to say, I need these 50 items that are property related, along with the deal property information. So you would select the deal property object in your user-defined fields. And think of that in terms of the data views for our left-hand nav panel. We have several, dozens, 100 data views available. So when you select a data view, that's what we call object-oriented, meaning that if I want to see the details of a dev deal property, I go to the dev deal property data view to see it. And if I have user-defined fields related to that property information, property specific information, then I can pull all the address information and coordinates and building types and build materials, etc., all in one place with an out-of-the-box data view. Also keep in mind your pick lists. So drop down values that are located on the screen. Almost all of those are configurable by you. So if you have new values that you want to add, you will go to your administrator, have them update the pick list value. That will now be selectable on your application. When you are ready to map your application using Smart Docs, one of the key components to laying the information out is to make sure that the data you're inputting on one screen is protected. And the best way to do that is to create a mapping tab. And so the example you see on the screen here, this tab gathers all the data throughout all the other sources and uses and deal team and project information tabs and puts them all into one place. And so where the advantage of that is it's easy to manage. You see it all in one area. It's broken up into sections, so it's easy to kind of scroll along. You can even include links at the top of this page to bounce down to these different sections. And it also contains the mapping in a place that's easy to map and also easy to edit and update. Because remember, when you roll this new funding program out on day one, 6 months later, we may learn some things, right? And we may need to make some changes. And so understanding where to make those changes and how to make those changes on a single tab is very useful, makes it much more efficient, and you're not chasing your tail on different tabs trying to figure out where all this information is located. The other thing to think about is any sort of formulas, any values you need to calculate before you actually use Smart Docs to store that data in our database. So this tab can include all the formulas, all the constraint tables, all the information that you need to say, I need to calculate a few fields, and I want to send that calculated value to ProLink because the input values aren't as important as that final stored value. So in addition to the mapping tab, that's kind of your one safeguard. Locking down the application is important as well. And so we do have a protect workbook function in Smart Docs that we want you to use. It's better than the Excel protection. It actually works better with ProLink Smart Docs. So use that. And we also see situations where clients will lock down, cells around input values. They'll also color code the input values to say like a green or a yellow or a blue. So it's really visual for an applicant to say, hey, I go to this screen, I see these green fields, I'm going to input these green fields. And you can lock down the labels next to them. You can lock down any other cell. So when they try to click into it, they just can't. I've mentioned user-defined fields. So again, if you don't see a data point on the screen that you want to capture, that's where a user-defined field comes into play. And then just as a side note here, when you are dealing with entities, developers and contractors, architects, everything that you want to store in the system, that goes into a feature called proxy entities. So it's different than entities themselves. We won't get into that during this webinar, but by all means, reach out to us if you want to learn more about proxy entities. We have job aids we can provide to show you how to store a proxy entity and then what you do to promote that proxy entity. So there are values that are in the dev deal, the dev module, that are not necessarily indicated on the screen that they are required. And for those of you who have been with us for a while, you'll know that we have red asterisks on the screen. Those red asterisks are required fields. If you try to save a record without populating those red asterisk labeled fields, you will get an error that says you can't save this record. So in addition to those very easy to indicate and understand input values, we do also have additional derived values that we need to understand as well. This is simply for us to be able to move the dev deal out of an intake stage. So we'll talk about a little bit about the intake stage coming up, but the idea is that when you create your deal, you are going to create it in the first stage called intake. That intake stage has some rules around it that are not shown on the screen. So those rules are as follows. First of all, you need to have an assigned user that has the activity role of development officer added to the deal. So that's part of the users table. A user will be set up as this particular activity role called development officer. We must have one of those as an assigned user on the deal. Secondly, we also must have a process type defined, and process type is a dropdown that is on DevDeal property, and it's indicating the funding that went into the deal at a high level. So the idea is you could have pick lists that says tax credit with home and state funding, or tax credit only, or new emergency funding program, or TBD. Does not matter what the value is, it just must be selected on the dev property in order for us to advance that stage. We are going to need a dev deal funding source, so we need at least one funding source. That shouldn't be a problem. All the applicants are going to be, selecting their funding sources, but that funding source must have a program type defined as well. And so program type is another dropdown, another pick list that's located on the dev deal funding source record. So these are not necessarily understood by most clients. In fact, most of my implementation clients look at this and say, we don't know the program type at this point, or I don't know how to define process type. Why are you asking me for this? So what we recommend is in the application, you derive the values, meaning you have auto selection that just will, when you add a funding source record, it will select it. That is something like TBD funding, or new program with additional funding, or state LIHTC with new funding source. Those kind of ideas can automatically populate both the process type and the program type pick list. And then once you do the send, you don't have to worry about the error you're going to get if you try to advance the stage out of intake without these values. Definitely reach out to us on this. I know it's a bit confusing, and use this particular screen to understand the requirements, but really it's easy to derive through an application and something that's kind of a set it and forget it. And then down the road, both of those pick lists will come into play, particularly process type. But in the meantime, this is a good way to bypass that if you are unclear on how to set it, or would not necessarily ask an applicant to select that for you. All right, so here, that was some of the application considerations. Now to set up the new funding program, we're going to need a few items. So first thing we're going to need is the new dev funding source. So it's a good idea to review your dev funding source list. It's under the utilities panel. And when you're looking at this list, you're going to have, several, up to hundreds of programs that you may have managed over the years. So it's a good idea to review those periodically and inactivate any old values for programs that no longer get funded and no longer are administered by the agency. And when you inactivate that, you're not losing the detail. So the historic funding sources like a TCAP program, for example, that no longer gets funded, well, we want to retain all the deals that were awarded that and the allocations per year for those awards, but we don't want that to be selectable on future deals. So by inactivating that on the dev funding source screen, you effectively remove it from selection, but retain all of the data. So you can always go back in history to determine how much those allocations were annually. This will also be important when you use the function of refreshing dropdowns in your application. So once you set everything up in ProLink HFA, new pick list values, set up user-defined fields with pick lists, you need to do a refresh dropdown. And basically that takes the Excel model and says, hey, look at the database, look at all the new values and pull them into this spreadsheet so we can go ahead and select them. Now, when you do that, you're going to get a list of every single funding source. Well, if I, as an applicant, I have one or two funding sources that I'm driven to for this new program, I only want to see those. So you can constrain the pick list. And by constraining the pick list within Excel, you're basically saying, here are 80 values. Here are the two that are selectable. And then you constrain that on the input value for the applicant, and they say, oh, here are the two I can select. And when they select it, the smart docs will automatically be able to drive to that funding source, and then you don't have to worry about any sort of misselection on that. So when you're setting up your funding source, there are a few very minimal inputs, but a couple of them are rather important. And so one of the recommendations is our source type dropdown. We recommend to use the source of other. And this is going to set us up to be able to use dev draws a little bit more seamlessly down the road. And our dev draws functionality, which we may discuss in a later webinar, basically will say what funding source are you drawing down against what line item. And when you use other, it will list the individual funding sources. The other indicator on the screen that you may want to consider is if you do have a bond backing this particular funding source, then you want to select require a financing source for this funding source. Then you would set up your what we call a fin source record, which is really a bond. And when you select the funding source, you're going to get a brand new dropdown that says which bond. And this will allow you to say it's a TBD bond until I know which issue that I can use, or it's the actual bond that is going to drive this program. If you don't have bond funding for your programs, then you leave that unchecked. So once you have your funding sources, we definitely recommend to roll your allocations up into the funding source round, and that would be by a name. So if you have a round one, round two, you can create a new program funding source round one, new program funding source round two, and then year over year, you are either in round one or round two. And then our allocation engine will effectively say, I'm awarding 10 deals, $1 million each on round one. That sums up to $10 million. So it is a really good way to see how much you've spent, or you may only have a limited amount to spend. So this can play into any sort of scoring you may have to say, well, I have 10 deals requesting $1 million each. I have $5 million in this program to disperse. Where am I going to award this and where's that cutoff? So the allocations are important, as well as the ability in a data view to group those allocations so you can see the total amount. And you can do that by accessing the admin data view panel and selecting our summon group and or summon footer. And if you see the screen, you see that it will show you the total amount of spend for every allocation per deal per fiscal year on that particular round. So when we're ready to create our deal, we highly recommend using a feature that's called ProLinkHFA blended deal. So it's a blended deal create. And so when you create a blended deal, what you're doing is you're creating a dev deal that's connected to a TCA deal. Now, originally our TCA deals and our dev deals were kind of thought of as two independent sides of the coin. So whoever was working on a TCA deal didn't need to worry about the funding and information on the dev deal and vice versa. So there's a lot of duplicative information on both sides, but we have learned through discussions with clients that really TCA, a tax credit, is merely a funding source on a full development deal. So the full capital stack comes into the dev deal. Well, that TC component can be used to say, well, here's the tax credit. And then more recently, we've also learned that, well, there's some really good stuff on the tax credit that we want to use based on any application that comes in. And a lot of that is driven by snapshotting of our TCA stages. So if I want to see costs as they move over time, I want to use the snapshotting in my tax credit stages. In order to use that, I want to be able to connect that with a dev deal. And to do so, you use blended deal create. So the other side of the coin for ProLink's ecosystem is that we have a work center. So every deal should have a corresponding work center. And so when we're setting up the new program, we want to create a new work center template because we have our tax credit templates and we have our asset management templates and we have our home dev deal templates, etc. Well, this new program will likely have new requirements or maybe limited requirements or maybe more restrictive requirements. So to create a new template, you want to consider something familiar to you, like the folder structure, the task list, and then look at it from the perspective of what am I actually requiring here? So by using tasks, you can define due dates if you have either a competitive round or you're just going to close the round application at a certain time. And you can use a task list to tell the applicant, what do I need to do? Where do I upload my files? So creating a work center template, very critical because that will be the first step to funding this program. And then we would also consider an internal work center. So ProLink has functionality in Procorum that says I can have as many work centers that are linked together and I can navigate through all of those. And the idea here is that if I have documents that are being uploaded via my external work center where my applicant resides, well, maybe I want to pull those in internally and do some redlining and commenting back and forth with my team. And using an internal work center allows you to seamlessly pull documents into that internal work center, work on them, comment, and then push out any action item you have for the applicant into the external work center. And remember, the developer, the applicant, is only part of the external work center, so they don't see anything that's going on that internal work center. All right, so we have everything that we're going to need to get going on this. Now it's ready to launch the program and open up the application round. So first thing that we are going to do is we're going to consider using Procorum Deal Work Center to house the application. Now, there are clients who house that application on their own internal website. And the idea is that there's no intention, there's no phone call saying, hey, I want to apply for this program. How do I do it? They simply just grab the application and run with it. Well, what we would like to enforce is that if you have a work center, you basically have an intent to apply. And when you create the work center, you're housing the structure and the task list that the applicant must adhere to, including due dates that they must follow with notifications. Hey, that due date's coming up, so make sure you get your application in. And if we adhere to that, then you have everything you need to roll the program out, including a document that says, here's how you apply to that program. So the first thing we recommend is to create that new work center. We do have, I believe, one client right now who has the work center link directly on their website. So that's kind of a nice way to say, hey, they click that, it notifies the agency, I have an intent to apply. You open up the work center, you import the appropriate template that we just talked about, you add the applicant as a collaborator, and then you add the internal deal team who's going to be working on this as a collaborator. And then you do the same thing for the internal work center. You just don't add the applicant into that internal work center, and then you link them both together. Once they've submitted the application, they should be driven by tasks that they are asked to complete. And so the completion of that task basically takes that checkbox and turns that you see on the screen and turns it green. And that green checkbox is going to say, hey, I, the applicant, have uploaded this document to the best of my ability, and we should be good to go. You can layer in approvals where you can look at the document, bring it to the internal work center, go redline it, comment, push it back out, and say either, hey, you need more work on this, or I approve it. Some clients don't like the approvals at this step because they don't want to give an applicant a false sense of hope that, hey, well, you approved this. Yeah, I approved it, but you just still didn't hit the scoring threshold. So consider whether or not you want approvals at this level. But if not, you at least have a list of what the applicant has submitted and by a due date if that is being enforced. Then we create the ProLink blended deal. So we recommend going through my dev activities because we want to think of a dev deal as a parent, right? It's the capital stack and all the funding and closing we're going to go through, and the tax credit side is just that one component to snapshot information. On the new blended deal crate, you will be asked to fill out some required information. So usually driven by the fiscal year, the allocation cycle. the allocation cycle on the TCA side. You can create a value in the pick list in the dropdown that says non-LIHTC funding or new emergency program. And what that does is it keeps the allocation track and bucket within that pick list value and doesn't over allocate like a 4% or a 9% that you will also have available because you're still running your normal competitive and non-competitive LIHTC deals. Add the work center. So when you do set this up, you're going to want to set primary work center, which is in the header link, and you're linking the existing work center. So keep that in mind. You won't create new. We already have the work center created. The applicants already worked on it. There's a bunch of documents there. So we want a link, which is going to open up a search window to find that deal name. And once you find it, click it. That link is seamless, and now you have the input into the work center that you're going to need to pull documents back into ProLinkHFA. Set up the deal team, so assigned users, that will be important. And download the application and do the send. Once you do the send, you're good to go. And then you just need to go in the screens to figure out where you need to find that data. So here's a list of the general locations. But remember, you built the application, so you already know where that data is driven. And then finally, don't forget custom data views. That's a new feature we have. To combine data from Dev and TC, you can go ahead and combine any screens and any fields together, and they will show up in a custom data view. And in the end, if you are stuck or have any sort of questions or you want our help, this is what we do. So we have a lot of experience in implementations. Give us a call. We can be simple support, or we can roll the entire program through full discovery for you. So support@prolinksolutions.com is where we want to go. So any questions? I know we are over time right now, so I want to definitely open up to anything that might need further clarification.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for taking through that wonderful presentation. Any questions can be posted in our Q&A right now, and we'll definitely be sure to share them with any of the presentation materials in our follow-up email with everybody that is here. I also just want to wrap up quickly to introduce next month's webinar. Next month, we're going to be featuring Alessandra Billy, who is a business solution analyst too here at ProLink. She's going to be covering comparing sources and use application intake and closing using a custom data view. So we're sharing the registration link in the chat right now. So if you'd like to join us for our next webinar, make sure you click that link. Thank you again for joining and have a wonderful rest.